Caleb Morgan woke each day before the sun reached Montana's Bitterroot Valley. The mornings came cold even in late spring, and the house felt emptier than he could bear to admit. The ranch wasn't much anymore, just a few fenced acres, the leaning barn, and the echo of a family life that had ended with Martha's passing 5 years back. But he still rose at dawn, pulled on his boots, and walked the yard as though duty itself kept him alive. The only constant, the only soul who shared those mornings without fail, was Duke, his old cattle dog. Duke was leaner now, ribs showing beneath a once thick coat, but his eyes held a sharpness that no age had dimmed. If Caleb was the caretaker of land, Duke was the caretaker of silence, the one who noticed every shift of wind, every trace of scent. That loyalty had carried them through blizzards, dry summers, and nights when loneliness pressed heavily. Caleb didn't talk much to people anymore. The nearest town of Darby was 10 miles off, and most days he had no reason to make the trip. Supplies came once a week, coffee and kerosene and the occasional sack of grain. The rest he managed alone. His neighbors' men like Ezra Crow didn't stop by unless they wanted something, and Ezra always wanted something. So Caleb's world had narrowed house, yard, barn, and Duke. Every rancher knows that dogs don't just guard, they notice. Caleb remembered once years back when Duke barked until he finally followed him to the chicken coop. A fox had slipped through a gap in the wire, and the hens were in chaos. That night, Duke had saved half the flock. Another time in deep winter, Duke stopped him from leading cattle across a frozen creek. The ice looked solid. It wasn't. The dog had whined and refused to move until Caleb trusted him enough to turn back. 2 days later, the ice collapsed in the thaw. Stories like that built a man's faith in an animal. Not blind faith, but the kind that grows when instinct proves truer than sight. That was why these new habits unsettled him. Duke had begun watching the barn at sundown, pacing the porch until Caleb stepped outside. He didn't bark. He didn't bolt. He just stared. Hour after hour, head fixed toward the weathered boards where horses once stamped their hooves and Martha once sang while she brushed their coats. Caleb thought it might be raccoons or even a black bear nosing around for feed scraps. But when he checked, nothing stirred. Just shadows and the smell of dust. It was easier to tell himself the dog was old, his mind slipping. Animals get restless when their bodies begin to fail. Yet something in Duke's eyes said otherwise. It wasn't confusion, it was a focus. The same kind of focus Caleb had seen when Duke held a wolf pack at bay on the ridge one winter night. Fearless, fixed, and unyielding. Only this time the focus carried a tremor, as though what he saw was too heavy even for him to face. Life on an isolated ranch teaches you two kinds of lessons: what you can control and what you can't. Caleb had learned to fix fences, mend roofs, and tend to injuries with nothing but cloth and whiskey. He could control those things, but he couldn't control grief. Couldn't control the silence of evenings when Martha's absence pressed harder than the wind rattling the window panes. And he couldn't control Duke's vigil. Night after night, the dog returned to the same spot, staring, refusing food, barely resting. Caleb would watch from his chair inside hand, on a mug of bitter coffee, and wonder what called so strongly from that barn. Dogs carry a wisdom we often overlook. They remind us that attention is not wasted, that sometimes survival depends on watching what others dismiss. Caleb knew men who ignored their dogs' warnings and paid the price. Cattle lost to predators, cabins broken into by bears. Even one neighbor who walked straight into a cougar's path because he brushed off his hound's growl. The wild doesn't give second chances, so Caleb found himself torn. Should he push Duke away? Force him back inside, insist nothing was wrong? Or should he honor the silence, honor the stare, and admit the barn held more than just boards and memory? What makes this simple story powerful isn't the mystery of the barn alone. It's the bond between man and animal. In every state across the country, Montana, Alaska, Wyoming, even the woodlands of Maine, people who live close to wilderness share this truth. Dogs notice first. They notice the scent of a grizzly bear carried on the wind, the shift of wolves gathering near the faint tremor in the earth before a storm. And they act not from fear, but from duty to the one they love. That is loyalty. That is what Duke was offering Caleb in those restless nights. There's a lesson in that for anyone, whether you live on open range or in a suburban neighborhood. Sometimes the most valuable signals come not from words, not from explanations, but from presence. From the quiet insistence of someone or some animal who refuses to look away. Our task is not to dismiss, but to listen, even when it unsettles us. Caleb's life had already been shaped by ignoring warnings. Martha's illness had shown signs long before he convinced her to see a doctor. By the time she went, it was too late. He still carried that guilt, the sense that if he had paid closer attention, if he had trusted the signs earlier, she might still be alive. So, watching Duke now, watching him starve himself rather than leave his post, Caleb felt the old weight of regret stirring. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. One evening, after splitting wood until his shoulders burned, he set down the axe and walked across the yard. Duke didn't move, only flicked his ears at the sound of boots crunching gravel. Caleb crouched beside him, laid a hand on the rough fur and whispered, "What do you see, boy?" His voice caught in the cool air. Together they stared at the barn. Nothing stirred. No owl shifted, no mouse skittered, just silence. Yet in that silence, Caleb felt the hairs rise on his arms. He couldn't explain why. He only knew Duke was right to keep watch. Examples from real life show that dogs can detect seizures before they strike cancer, before machines do danger, before humans sense it. Caleb didn't know those studies, but he knew the truth written in his dog's trembling muscles. The lesson for him and for us is that instinct sharpened by love carries a weight science can't always measure. As he rose, Caleb's gaze lingered on the barn one last time. He noticed how the roof sagged like an old back bent beneath years. He noticed how the doors leaned inward as though the building itself resisted opening. And for the first time in years, he wondered what secrets might still rest beneath its shadow. He touched Duke's head, a silent promise. Whatever drew the dog to this vigil, they would face it together. Because survival on the frontier, whether in 1880 or today, never belonged to the strongest alone. It belonged to those who listened. And so the stage was set. Caleb, his loyal companion, and a barn that seemed to hold more than silence. What came next would test not just his faith in Duke, but his understanding of the wild itself. Because soon the scratching would begin. Caleb had long since accepted silence as a kind of companion. Nights in the Bitterroot Valley were wide and heavy, the kind where even the wind seemed reluctant to stir. But lately that silence had grown heavier, as if holding its breath. He would sit on the porch, mug in hand, Duke at his feet, both staring at the barn that sagged in the fading light. Most nights nothing moved, just shadows stretching across weathered boards. Then came the night when silence broke. At first he thought it was nothing. The kind of sound you explain away a branch, brushing wood, a mouse in the rafters. But Duke froze. Every muscle stiffened. His nose twitched, ears pinned forward. Then Caleb heard it too. A faint, deliberate scratching. Not the scuttle of a rat, not the flutter of an owl's wings. This was steady, slow, like claws dragging against old timber. He held his breath. Duke trembled, but did not bark. That silence was worse than any growl. He remembered nights when Duke had faced down wolves. The dog had never flinched, not once. Yet now he quivered. Caleb felt the same chill crawl up his back. Whatever stirred inside that barn was something different. Something heavier than vermin. Something that reached through silence and claimed attention. He wanted to move, to open the door and put an end to doubt, but his boots felt nailed to the porch. It is easy to dismiss what we cannot explain. People in towns do it every day. Strange creaks in the attic, odd knocks in the pipes. They tell themselves it's nothing because nothing is safer than facing unknowns. But in the wilderness, ignoring small sounds is dangerous. Many ranchers in Montana can tell you stories scratching that turned out to be a black bear tearing into a grain bin, or faint scuffing that signaled a cougar testing the edges of a chicken run. In wild country, sound is language, and language ignored becomes regret. Caleb thought of a story an old trapper once shared in Derby. The man had been camped near the Sapphire Mountains when he heard scratching against his tent in the dead of night. He assumed it was squirrels. By morning, half his food was gone. Tracks told the truth a young grizzly had been bold enough to nose through canvas while he slept. If I'd opened that flap without knowing, the trapper said, you wouldn't be hearing the story. Caleb thought about that now as he stared at the barn. How many times do we label danger as harmless simply because we'd rather not face it? Duke let out a low whine, a sound Caleb had rarely heard. It carried not just fear but urgency. The dog's instincts were honed by 12 years of living close to predators. Caleb trusted that, but another part of him resisted. He wanted this scratching to be harmless. He wanted the barn to hold only dust and memory. Because if it were more, if something truly lived inside, then he would be forced to act. And acting meant risk. This was the moral weight pressing on him to look away and live with unease, or to step forward and face what might be waiting. The choice was not simple. Men like Caleb know that curiosity can be deadly. Yet he also knew that ignoring signs carried its own price. His wife's illness had taught him that. By pretending her cough was just a cold, he had waited too long. The barn now whispered the same temptation, pretend it's nothing. But Duke's eyes said otherwise. There is a lesson here beyond the ranch. We live in a world full of scratching sounds, warnings about our health, about relationships, about the environment. Sometimes they're faint, easy to dismiss. But what we ignore out of fear or convenience often grows louder until it demands our attention in ways we cannot avoid. Caleb was standing in that tension, torn between silence and truth. He rose slowly from his chair, set his mug aside, and walked down the steps. Gravel crunched under his boots. Duke stayed pressed to his side, body taut, tail low. Together they crossed the yard. The scratching stopped. The barn loomed ahead, its doors sagging inward like tired lungs. Caleb laid a hand on the rough wood, felt the vibration of silence itself. Nothing moved inside. He waited, straining to catch the faintest sound. For a moment, he wondered if his mind had played tricks. Then from the far wall came another scrape. Longer this time. Deliberate. His hand drifted toward the knife at his belt. He glanced down at Duke. The dog's lips pulled back over yellowed teeth, yet no sound came. That silence was loyalty and warning wrapped together. Caleb whispered, "Easy, boy," though his own voice trembled. He pulled the door crack. Darkness pressed back. The smell of dust and old straw filled his nose. His eyes adjusted slowly. Same rafters, same tools on their hooks, same emptiness. Yet his bones told him different. This is where perspective shifts. To an outsider, the scene is simple, an old man spooked by noises. But to someone who lives close to the wilderness, every sound carries a story. A scratch might be a mouse, or it might be the first sign of a grizzly cub nosing for shelter. Silence might mean safety, or it might mean a predator waiting still. Those who survive in such places learn humility, the recognition that human senses are often last to know. Caleb stepped back, closed the door, and breathed out slowly. He knew he couldn't force the truth tonight. But he also knew the scratching would return. The barn had become more than a memory. It was now a question demanding an answer. The fresh perspective here is about trust. Not blind trust, but the kind built over years of shared survival. Duke wasn't staring into shadows for nothing. His vigil, his trembling, his silence, these were data as real as any footprints in soil. Caleb realized the choice was no longer about whether something lived inside the barn. The choice was about whether he valued comfort more than truth. Later that night, as he lay in bed, he listened to Duke pacing on the porch, back and forth claws clicking against wood, pausing each time he faced the barn. Caleb stared at the ceiling, thinking of the trapper's story. Thinking of Martha's cough, thinking of the sound he could no longer dismiss. The scratching was not going away, neither was the question. And so the stage shifted. What began as silence had turned into a warning. What began as unease had become an invitation. The barn no longer stood as just a relic of Martha's past. It stood as a doorway to something hidden, something alive. Caleb knew the time was coming when he would have to uncover it. But before that moment, the earth itself would reveal its own clue. Morning light came thin and gray across the Bitterroot Valley, the kind that made every shape in the yard look softer yet somehow less trustworthy. Caleb Morgan stepped outside with Duke at his heel, the cold biting through his jacket. He expected the dog to circle the porch as usual, but Duke didn't wander. His eyes locked once more on the barn. Nose twitching, muscles taut. Whatever had scratched in the dark hadn't left with the night. Caleb followed the dog across the yard, boots crunching on frosted grass. At the eastern wall of the barn, Duke froze. His paws dug into the ground like he had anchored himself there. Caleb knelt beside him and noticed the dirt. It wasn't hard-packed like the rest of the yard. It was loose, darker, as though it had been turned recently. He brushed his fingers through it. The soil gave way too easily, like someone or something had been digging there. The sight unsettled him more than the scratching had. Because scratching could be explained by raccoons, by stray cats, or even by a black bear nosing for grain. But freshly disturbed earth meant hands. Someone had been here. Someone had chosen this spot. He leaned closer and saw faint marks in the dirt. Not animal paw prints, but narrow grooves, like clawing or maybe the edge of a shovel. He remembered an old neighbor from his younger days, a man who always told stories about gold fever. That neighbor once said, "If you want to know a man's secrets, look at where the dirt's been moved." Caleb had laughed it off at the time, but the memory came back sharp now. Secrets lived in soil, and soil doesn't lie. Duke whined and stepped back, tail low, eyes never leaving the patch. Caleb felt the same unease but forced himself to stay. He dug gently with his fingers. Only an inch down, his hand struck fabric. He froze. The texture was wrong, too coarse for roots, too stiff for burlap feed sacks. It felt like canvas, the kind used to wrap things heavy, the kind meant to hide more than protect. He pulled back quickly, heart hammering. His first thought wasn't of discovery, but of danger. Who had buried something at his barn? Why here? The nearest neighbor was Ezra Crow, and Ezra didn't exactly have a reputation for kindness. Caleb's late father-in-law used to warn him, "Crow's a man who buys loyalty when he can and steals what he can't." Folks in town whispered about him skimming cattle, swindling mining partners, always coming out ahead while others came up short. If Ezra had reason to bury something, it wouldn't be innocent. This is where the lesson sharpens: disturbed ground is never just dirt. In life too, when things look unsettled, relationships, finances, health, there is often something beneath the surface waiting to be uncovered. Pretending the soil is untouched doesn't change the truth. It just delays the moment of reckoning. Caleb's hand on that canvas was his reckoning. He sat back, forcing a slow breath. Duke pressed close, body rigid. The dog's fear wasn't ordinary. This wasn't the trembling of a storm or the unease of a passing coyote. It was deeper, heavier, as though he sensed something foul clinging to that patch of earth. Animals often know before we do. Science explains it in terms of smell, vibration, and instinct. But anyone who has lived close to dogs or horses, or even bears, knows it feels like more than that. It feels like second sight. Caleb thought about grizzly bears he'd seen near the valley ridges. They dig constantly dens, caches, shallow pits to search for roots. A bear's digging always has a purpose. He remembered watching one turn over rocks for insects, its paws precise despite their size. Looking now at the loosened soil near his barn, he thought of those bears. The difference was clear: an animal digs to live. A man digs to hide. He considered the risks. If he dug further and found something dangerous, contraband, stolen goods, maybe worse, he would have to explain why it was on his land. And explanations in an isolated country rarely went in favor of the innocent. Sheriff's men from Hamilton might take weeks to sort it out, and by then, word would spread, reputations ruined. Yet if he walked away, the scratching, the unease, the stares from Duke would never stop. He'd be living beside a question he was too afraid to answer. This is a crossroad many face even outside ranch life. Do you investigate what unsettles you, risking discomfort but gaining clarity? Or do you leave it buried, protecting your peace but letting ignorance fester. Caleb stood in that tension, caught between the safety of denial and the danger of truth. He thought of Martha again, of how she used to say barns were places of beginnings. Foals born in straw calves stumbling to their feet. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same building now felt like a tomb. Symbolism has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. The barn, once a cradle of life, was now tied to secrets buried in its shadow. Duke shifted, pressing his head against Caleb's arm as if urging him away. The dog's loyalty wasn't just in protection, it was in knowing when to resist. That gave Caleb pause. Sometimes the wisest act isn't charging forward, but waiting for the right time. He wiped the soil from his hands and stood, gaze lingering on the patch. Perspective matters here. To the eye, it was just dirt by a wall. To the spirit, it was a warning, a marker of something hidden. Caleb understood now why Duke had refused food, why he had spent nights trembling yet unmoving. The dog wasn't fixated on shadows. He was standing guard over what the earth itself was trying to conceal. That realization carried its own weight. It meant Caleb wasn't imagining things. It meant his life had already intersected with something larger. Something that drew in silence, scratching disturbed earth. And whether he liked it or not, he was already involved. Later, back inside, he tried to distract himself with chores, stacking firewood, mending a broken hinge, boiling coffee, until the air filled with its bitter scent. But each task felt hollow. His mind kept returning to the soil, to the feel of canvas beneath his fingers. What was wrapped in that ground? Why had Duke treated it as though it carried death, and most importantly, who had chosen his barn as the place to bury it? Real-life examples of buried secrets lingered in his memory. Old newspaper clippings about rustlers caught because they buried stolen hides too shallowly. Stories of miners who hid their claims in canyons only to be discovered by fresh-turned soil visible from the ridges. History proved again and again hidden things rarely stay hidden. The earth itself betrays them. That was the lesson Caleb carried into the evening. Secrets demand to be uncovered. Soil remembers every hand that moves it. And animals with their sharper senses often speak truth long before people are willing to listen. By the time dusk returned, Duke was back at his post, eyes fixed, body stiff. Caleb sat on the porch, mug cooling in his hand, and felt the weight of choice pressing down. He knew he couldn't ignore the soil forever. Whatever was hidden at that foundation wasn't going to rest quietly. Soon it would demand his full attention, and that moment was closer than he thought. Because as night settled, the scratching came again, longer, heavier, insistent. The barn was no longer just a building. It was a voice. And the next discovery would not be fabric. It would be life itself. The decision came at dawn, as so many decisions on a ranch do. Caleb Morgan pulled on his jacket, hefted the shovel, and walked toward the eastern wall of the barn. Duke trailed close but restless, whining low, as though pleading for his master to turn back. Caleb paused, hand on the worn handle, and whispered, "We've got to know, boy." The first scoop of soil came easy, too easy. Whoever had dug here had been in a hurry, leaving the earth loose, unsettled. Each stroke cut deeper, the smell of damp dirt rising sharply in the chill air. Duke paced behind him, claws scratching nervously at the porch boards. Caleb's hands shook, but he kept working. Inch by inch the ground gave way, then the blade struck canvas. He dropped the shovel, knelt, and cleared dirt with his hands. Fingers found the fabric rough and frayed. He pulled carefully, heart hammering with the weight of what might be wrapped inside. The canvas gave peeling back like a secret too long held. Caleb braced himself for something terrible. A carcass, a crime. But what met him instead blinked weakly in the pale light. It was alive. A grizzly bear cub no bigger than a farm dog lay tangled in the folds. Its fur was matted, its ribs sharp under skin, its breath shallow but stubborn. For a moment, Caleb couldn't move. He had expected death. He had uncovered life. Duke barked once, sharp, confused, then fell silent, ears pinned. The cub whimpered, a sound so thin it cut deeper than any growl. Caleb reached out slowly, hands trembling. The cub didn't resist. Too weak, too starved. He lifted it gently, feeling the frail weight, the tremor of survival still clinging to its frame. A grizzly cub here, hidden beneath the soil of his barn. He looked at Duke, whose eyes widened, body frozen. Neither man nor dog had expected this. To understand the shock, you must know grizzlies. These bears, massive and feared, are fiercely protective of their young. A cub this small should have been with its mother, learning how to forage roots, how to follow salmon, how to den in winter. Cubs stay close for at least 2 years. Alone, their odds of survival drop near zero. That is why biologists in Yellowstone and Alaska speak with such urgency when orphaned cubs are found. Without intervention, they don't last. So the questions came fast. Why was it here? Who had taken the time to wrap it in canvas, to bury it shallow, but not suffocate it? And why at his barn the mystery deepened, but so did the responsibility. Caleb thought of examples he'd read in the Missoula paper cub rescues where wildlife sanctuaries stepped in. In 2020, 2 orphaned grizzly cubs were flown to Montana from Alaska, raised in care until they could fend for themselves in protected ranges. Another story told of a cub rescued near Glacier, its mother killed by a train. Rangers called it a miracle that it survived long enough to be found. Those stories carried a pattern. Cubs only lived when humans acted quickly. Delay meant death. The lesson pressed on Caleb now when life reveals itself fragile and unexpected. You don't look away. You act. Sometimes the hardest part isn't lifting the shovel or peeling back the canvas. It's deciding that the discovery isn't someone else's problem. It's yours. He carried the cub inside the barn, away from the wind. Duke followed at a cautious distance, nose twitching, body low. Caleb set the animal down on the straw. Its eyes fluttered open, dark pools filled with exhaustion. It whimpered again, the sound smaller than it should have been. Caleb touched its head, gently whispering, "Easy now. You're safe." He didn't know if that was true, but speaking it aloud mattered. Fresh perspective comes here. To many, a grizzly cub is only a danger waiting to grow. They picture the claws, the size, the stories of hikers attacked in backcountry trails. But up close, in the trembling breath of an orphaned cub, another truth emerges. Vulnerability. Even the wildest creatures begin in helplessness, reliant on care. It's a mirror to us all. Strength is earned, not given, and it begins with being carried through weakness. Caleb thought of Martha again, how she once cradled a foal born too early, warming it with blankets until sunrise. She used to say, "Every creature deserves a chance, Caleb, even if it's just one more day." The memory struck hard. Here was another fragile life left in his hands. He couldn't turn away. Still unease gnawed. Who had left the cub here? Why in such a strange manner, wrapped, buried, shallow enough to be found alive, but starving? It wasn't the work of nature. It was the mark of human choice. And if humans had chosen to hide a grizzly cub on his land, then more questions would follow. Questions from neighbors, from lawmen, from people he didn't trust. The soil told one truth: something had been hidden. The canvas told another: someone had meant for it to stay hidden. But the cub itself, the soft breath, the faint whimper that told the final truth. Secrets can stay buried, but life will fight to be seen. That's the small lesson here. We spend so much energy covering what we don't want others to notice, whether guilt or grief or failure. Yet life has a way of clawing back into the light. Just as Duke refused to stop staring, just as the soil betrayed its disturbance, the cub refused to die. Truth doesn't rest easy underground. Duke crept closer, nose reaching out, then pulled back sharply. His loyalty wasn't just to Caleb, it was to warning him of danger he couldn't yet name. And maybe he was right. Because with every minute the cub lay there, the mystery grew heavier. Caleb sat in the straw, hands resting on his knees, staring at the fragile animal. He felt the tension of two worlds pressing together: the wild one where cubs belong to mothers and mountains, and the human one where secrets are buried in soil and barns carry shadows. He knew those worlds don't mix without cost. Yet he also knew this. He couldn't put the soil back over what he had uncovered. Not now. Not ever. Responsibility once revealed cannot be buried again. Outside, the valley shifted with evening wind. The barn groaned against its own weight, and from the south road came the sound of hoofbeats, measured, deliberate, approaching fast. The cub whimpered once more. Duke growled low and sharp. Caleb rose, heart thudding. The discovery of life had already tied itself to danger. Whoever buried a secret here would surely return for it. And the first rider to appear was the one neighbor he trusted least. The hoofbeats grew louder, steady as a drum beat, until dust rose on the south road. Caleb Morgan knew that sound well. Only one man in the valley rode with such deliberate pace, as though each step of his horse was measured to remind others who held the advantage. Ezra Crow. Caleb's hand rested on the barn door. Duke bristled at his side growl, rising low in his throat. Inside, the grizzly bear cub whimpered softly, shifting in the straw. Caleb's mind raced. Of all neighbors, Ezra was the last he wanted near this discovery. Not because Ezra was curious, but because Ezra already knew too much. Ezra reined in his horse at the porch, tall in the saddle clothes, too fine for ranch work boots, polished as if they'd never seen mud. He carried himself like a man who belonged to the land, but refused to let the land mock him. That alone set him apart. In places like the Bitterroot Valley, a rancher's hands tell his story. Calluses, scars, broken nails. Those are marks of honest work. Ezra's hands told a different story. Smooth palms, soft knuckles. No sign of the toil others carried. "Morning, Caleb." He called voice even, but stripped of warmth. His gaze swept the yard, lingering too long on the disturbed soil by the barn. "You've been busy." Caleb forced calm into his voice. "Just tending to drainage issues. Ground's been shifting." He positioned himself between Ezra and the barn door, feeling Duke press against his leg, hackles high. The tension here wasn't new. Ezra had built his reputation on advantage. Years back, he had tangled in a mining claim dispute that left 2 men ruined while he walked away with the deed. Folks whispered about cattle that went missing near his land, about debts collected with intimidation rather than law. But nothing ever stuck. Ezra had a way of twisting the truth until it favored him. And in small communities, when one man held enough power, suspicion wasn't enough to bring justice. Caleb had always kept his distance. He knew men like Ezra thrived on entangling others. If they pull you into their schemes, even unwillingly, you carry the stain. That was the danger now. Ezra's eyes narrowed toward the barn. "Funny thing about drainage," he said slowly. "We haven't had rain in weeks. This is where explanation matters. In frontier life and in ranching today, neighbors are both a necessity and a risk. You rely on them for help when storms collapse fences or when predators threaten herds. But you also measure them carefully. A neighbor with integrity can save you. A neighbor with greed can destroy you." Ezra Crow embodied the latter. Duke's growl deepened. Caleb placed a hand on the dog's back, steadying him. Ezra dismounted with deliberate slowness, boots striking the earth. "What's got your dog so riled?" he asked, eyes fixed not on Duke, but on Caleb. "Maybe he caught scent of wolves," Caleb replied. It was half true. Wolves roamed the ridges this time of year, but the greater predator stood in front of him. Ezra smirked slightly. "Wolves can smell death before we do. That's why they linger near graves." His words carried weight beyond casual talk. Here lies the lesson: predators come in many forms. Some prowl with teeth and claws, others with contracts and lies. Both know how to exploit weakness. Recognizing the difference and knowing when to defend yourself can mean survival. Ezra walked closer, boots grinding loose soil. He paused near the very patch Caleb had disturbed, toe nudging the earth. "Strange spot for drainage," he said. "Seems more like a place a man might bury something." His eyes flicked to the barn, then back to Caleb. This is where perspective shifts. To Ezra, everything was an opportunity. If there was value buried, he wanted it. If there was trouble, he wanted Caleb to carry the blame. That was his reputation. Let others pay the cost while he collected the prize. The entire valley knew it, but few dared to oppose him. Caleb felt the weight of moral struggle press heavier. He had choices: reveal the cub and risk Ezra twisting the story, or hide it and live with suspicion gnawing at his name. Neither felt safe. But silence often carries its own risk. Secrets once buried rarely stay that way. Real-world parallels echo here. Ranching communities across Montana and Wyoming often share tales of neighbors who cut corners, who poach wildlife, who claim land not theirs. Some families live with those consequences for generations. Reputation in such places isn't just gossip, it's currency. Lose it and you lose trust, help, and sometimes even safety. Caleb knew this truth too well. Ezra leaned casually against the fence, but his eyes stayed sharp. "I've been missing something," he said quietly. "Something valuable. Thought maybe you'd seen strangers pass through." His tone was smooth, but the implication ran deep. Ezra rarely searched. He already knew where to look. Caleb answered evenly. "Can't say I have. Not much traffic this far out." Ezra studied him, silent, stretching, then smiled without humor. "That's the thing about silence, neighbor. It hides more than it reveals." He turned toward the barn steps, deliberate. Duke lunged forward, barking fiercely now, body coiled. Caleb caught his collar just in time. Ezra stopped, smirk deepening. "Protective animal you've got there, loyal to the bone. And that is the fresh perspective. In a world full of men like Ezra, who bend loyalty for profit, animals like Duke stand as a contrast, pure, unshaken, devoted not by gain but by bond. That contrast is why people who live with dogs often trust them more than they trust other people. The cub whimpered again inside the barn. Caleb's heart raced. Did Ezra hear? The man tilted his head, listening. The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound. His eyes narrowed. "Strange noises in your barn," he said slowly. Caleb stepped forward, blocking the door. "Barn's old. Wood creaks." His voice carried more firmness than he felt. Ezra studied him for a long moment, then turned back toward his horse. "Old wood doesn't usually cry like that," he muttered, mounting with fluid ease. He pulled on the reins, then added, "Keep an eye on your place, Caleb. Some things buried don't stay put." With that, he rode off, dust trailing behind. Caleb stood frozen. Duke growling low, the cub whimpering once more inside. Relief mixed with dread. Ezra suspected something, and Ezra never walked away from suspicion without a plan. The small lesson here: sometimes survival means more than facing predators head-on. It means recognizing when silence is a defense, when patience buys time. Caleb hadn't defeated Ezra, but he had delayed him, and delay matters when the stakes are life. As the hoofbeats faded, Caleb exhaled. Duke pressed close, and eyes still locked on the road. Inside the barn, the cub shifted weakly. Two worlds pressed together, one of loyalty, one of greed. And Caleb stood in the middle, carrying responsibility he hadn't chosen but couldn't refuse. And the next revelation would prove that Ezra's suspicions weren't guesswork at all. They were memories. Because tied around the neck of that fragile cub was something worth more than Ezra's land, his cattle, even his life. A silver locket carrying secrets that refused to stay buried. The moment Ezra Crow disappeared down the road, Caleb Morgan pushed open the barn door. Duke rushed in first, nose to the ground, circling the straw where the grizzly bear cub still lay weak and trembling. Caleb knelt, checking the animal again. He expected only exhaustion, ribs showing breath shallow, but as he brushed the matted fur around its neck, his fingers caught something hard beneath the coat. A chain. He pushed aside the tangles and found it a silver locket dulled by dirt, yet glinting faintly where light touched. For a long moment, Caleb just stared. A cub wrapped in canvas was strange enough, but a cub wearing jewelry. That was something else entirely. He worked the clasp carefully, lifting the locket free from the small body. The chain had rubbed raw patches on the cub's skin. Whoever placed it there had done so with intention, not accident. He opened the locket, half expecting to see initials, maybe a portrait. Instead, inside the silver was an etching fine lines carved with precision, forming ridges and valleys. A map. Not just any map, but one Caleb recognized. The Bitterroot Range itself, sketched with landmarks only locals would know, the bend in the river, shaped like a horseshoe, the twin peaks locals called the Brothers. The hidden gulch miners once swore held more silver than men could carry. Caleb's throat tightened. He knew the stories of the Lucky Strike mine, a claim whispered about since the 1860s, when prospectors swarmed Montana. Men said it was a vein so rich it could turn a poor rancher into a baron. But every search had failed. The claim was lost, its location buried with those who once knew it. Until now. The shock wasn't just the map, it was the memory it stirred. Martha's younger sister Delilah had once obsessed over those stories. She believed Ezra Crow had swindled their father, had stolen deeds, maybe even caused his death. Delilah swore she'd find proof that the mine still existed. Then, 3 years back, she vanished. Folks whispered she had run away west. Martha never believed it. Neither did Caleb. And now, holding the locket, he felt her presence as sharp as grief itself. The small cub whimpered, shifting weakly. Caleb pressed the locket shut, the silver warm in his palm. He whispered, "Delilah, what did you do?" Here's where the explanation deepens. Mining in Montana wasn't just history, it was bloodline. Whole families built legacies on claims, and whole families were destroyed when greed outweighed fairness. Records from the 19th century show disputes settled not in courts, but with rifles. When someone whispered about a new strike, men vanished, deeds disappeared, and graves multiplied. Ezra's reputation fit that pattern. He wasn't just a shady neighbor. He was a man, shaped by the same greed that had poisoned valleys across the state. Caleb thought of an example told often in town. 2 brothers who found silver near Phillipsburg. They trusted the wrong partner, and within months, one brother was dead, the other ruined, while the partner grew rich. Stories like that weren't folklore, they were warnings carved into memory. And here in his hands lay evidence that history wasn't done repeating itself. Greed doesn't die. It hides. It waits for a chance to surface like ore beneath stone. When it does, the test isn't whether you can seize it, but whether you can resist what it will demand from you. Caleb wasn't sure which choice he could make. He studied the map again, tracing the etched gulch. His stomach clenched. The mine wasn't a myth. It was marked here in silver, carried on the neck of an abandoned grizzly cub. That alone told him Delilah had been closer than anyone before, which meant Ezra wasn't circling him by chance. Ezra was circling because he knew. Duke growled softly, still pacing. Caleb felt the weight of the moment. If Ezra discovered the locket, he'd stop at nothing to claim the mine. And men like Ezra didn't just covet wealth, they erased anyone who stood in their way. Caleb thought of Martha's father dead in a so-called accident. Thought of Delilah vanished without a trace. Patterns told the truth even when people refused to speak it. Fresh perspective blooms here. To most, a silver locket is sentiment, a keepsake of love or memory. But in this valley, silver was more than jewelry. It was currency, ambition, temptation. The locket symbolized 2 roads, one built on loyalty and remembrance, the other on greed and betrayal. The grizzly cub, innocent and starving, carried that contradiction unknowingly. Nature bore the burden of man's ambition, a living reminder of how human hunger for wealth always spills into the wild. Caleb rubbed the locket between his fingers, thinking of choices. He could hide it, pretend he never saw the etching, bury it deeper than before. Or he could act, seek truth, expose Ezra, honor Delilah's risk. But acting meant risk to his land, his name, even his life. This is the crossroads many face even outside such frontier tales. Do we protect ourselves in silence, or do we speak truth? Though it costs. Caleb felt the weight as heavy as the shovel he had used to uncover the secret. The cub stirred, letting out another faint cry. Duke circled closer, sniffing, still uncertain whether to trust or resist. Caleb placed the locket gently back into his pocket, stood and whispered, "Some treasures aren't worth blood." But deep down he knew Ezra believed otherwise, and Ezra would return. Real-world comparisons drive the point further. Today, disputes over land rights, mineral leases, and water still pit neighbor against neighbor in rural America. Courts may replace rifles, but greed remains constant. Stories from Appalachia to Alaska echo the same truth when land carries hidden wealth. Human nature rarely chooses loyalty over gain. Caleb's valley was no different. True wealth isn't in silver veins or hidden maps. It's in loyalty and trust in bonds that outlast greed. Caleb looked at Duke, whose unwavering focus proved that. He looked at the cub, whose survival now depended entirely on care, not on claims etched in silver. And he thought of Martha, who once said, "Land can make a man rich, but love makes a man whole." Still, the world doesn't pause for reflection. Hoofbeats carried earlier still lingered in memory. Ezra knew something. And if Ezra wanted the mine, he wouldn't stop with suspicion. Caleb's discovery had pulled him into a storm larger than himself. As dusk fell, Caleb locked the barn door and Duke posted at guard once more. Inside, the cub slept fitfully, unaware of the human war brewing around it. Caleb rested his hand on the locket through his jacket pocket, the metal warm against his chest. Secrets had clawed their way to the surface. Now choices would decide whether loyalty or greed would shape what came next. And the choice would not wait. Because from the north tree line, new riders approached men who didn't come for cattle or conversation. They came for what was hidden in silver. The first rider appeared from the tree line just as the last of the daylight faded. Caleb Morgan stepped into the yard. Duke pressed close at his side, the silver locket heavy in his pocket. Inside the barn, the grizzly bear cub stirred, whimpering low. 3 riders in all, emerged horses, lathered their faces hard from long travel. They pulled up short at the sight of Caleb, the shovel still leaning against the barn wall. The fresh soil disturbed at his feet. One of them, young sharp-eyed bandana, pulled low, tipped his head toward the barn. "Afternoon, rancher. Looks like you've been busy." His voice carried confidence born not of honesty but of knowledge. He knew what he was looking for. Before Caleb could answer, hoofbeats thundered again. Ezra Crow rode back into the clearing, pistol at his hip, eyes flicking from Caleb to the riders. His face tightened. "Didn't expect you this far north," he said coldly. The leader smiled thinly. "Funny, Ezra. We could say the same about you. Thought you buried your problems deeper." His gaze landed on the disturbed earth, then on Caleb. But it seems someone dug them back up. Duke barked sharp and warning, circling between Caleb and the men. The cub whimpered louder inside the sound carrying in the evening stillness. Ezra's hand twitched toward his weapon. The leaders did the same. Here's where explanation matters. In places like Montana, where law rides days behind trouble, disputes rarely wait for courts. They play out in dust and gunpowder. Frontier justice was simple strength, speed, or numbers decided who walked away. It wasn't fair, but it was final. Even today, stories linger, ranchers feuding over water rights disputes that ended not with signatures, but with fists or worse. Caleb's heart pounded. He wasn't part of this war, but silence no longer protected him. By uncovering the cub and the locket, he had stepped into it. The young leader nudged his horse forward. "We came for what Ezra promised us. He was supposed to deliver. Instead, he left it buried here." Ezra's voice snapped. "You'll get nothing. The mine is mine." He drew his pistol. Gunfire cracked the evening. Caleb dove behind the barn wall as splinters burst from the wood. Duke lunged forward, barking furiously, darting between the chaos. Horses reared, shots rang, shouts echoed. The lesson emerges. Violence escalates fast when greed rules. What began as whispers and secrets now roared in gunfire. And the innocent, like a rancher or a starving cub, were the first caught in its storm. Caleb crouched, listening to shots trade. He peeked through a gap in the boards. Ezra crouched behind his horse, firing steadily. One rider fell, clutching his shoulder blood, darkening his shirt. Another circled wide, trying to flank. The leader, Jesse, shouted orders, his eyes burning with rage. Duke darted to Caleb's side, panting hard, but unharmed. Caleb rested a hand on his fur. The dog trembled not with fear, but with energy, ready to defend. Caleb whispered, "Stay with me, boy." He scanned the ground and spotted Jesse's dropped rifle lying just feet away. With a deep breath, Caleb lunged, grabbed it, and rolled back behind cover. His hands shook as he leveled the weapon, but survival left no space for hesitation. This is the moment where perspective shifts. A man who wanted only quiet ranch life now stood in the middle of a gunfight, forced to choose sides. He didn't want treasure. He didn't want blood. But choices not made are still choices. And silence in the face of violence is its own kind of surrender. Caleb fired, once the shot striking close enough to send Jesse's horse rearing. The leader cursed, ducking low. Ezra took advantage, sending another bullet that grazed Jesse's arm. Chaos spread. Real-world parallels remind us that greed-driven violence isn't just history. Even in modern times, disputes over land oil or minerals still ignite conflict, whether in Montana's valleys or across the world. The weapons may change, but the motives don't. Ezra and Jesse weren't just men in a story. They were reflections of a timeless truth: when men value wealth over loyalty, others always pay the cost. Duke barked again, suddenly and sharply, then lunged toward the barn. Caleb turned just in time to see the dog scratching frantically at the straw, tearing it aside. The cub cried out louder now, fear mixing with exhaustion. The sound froze every gunman. Jesse's head whipped toward it, his face twisted with fury. "You fool, Ezra. You buried her with the necklace." Caleb's chest clenched. So the cub wasn't just a burden of chance. It was bait tied to a greater secret. Ezra's greed had left loose ends, and those loose ends were clawing their way into daylight. Shots thundered again. Caleb returned firewood, splintering, dust rising. Ezra shouted threats. Jesse shouted back. The riders scattered, one wounded, one circling. For long minutes, the yard became a battlefield, each man scrambling for advantage. The small lesson here: conflict built on lies cannot be controlled. Ezra thought he could bury his schemes. Jesse thought he could force loyalty through fear. Both underestimated how truth refuses to stay buried, how even the weakest, an old rancher, a starving cub, a loyal dog, can unravel their plans. Through the smoke and shouting, Caleb saw Ezra stumble. Jesse had flanked him, pistol raised. Time slowed. Caleb squeezed the trigger of the rifle. The shot rang true. Jesse fell, his weapon clattering in the dirt. Silence followed, heavy, broken only by the whimper of the cub. Ezra turned, face pale with shock. For the first time, his confidence cracked. He looked at Caleb, then at the barn. The locket, the cub, the map. His voice came ragged. "You don't know what you're holding, Morgan. That silver is worth more than this valley." Caleb rose slowly, rifle still leveled. Duke pressed against his leg, snarling low. Caleb's voice was steady. "Some things aren't worth their cost, Ezra. Not your mine, not your lies, and not another life." That is the fresh perspective. Frontier justice isn't about who draws fastest. It's about choices in moments of truth. Ezra chose greed. Jesse chose violence. Caleb chose loyalty to his land, to his dog, to the memory of those lost. Ezra hesitated, pistol twitching in his hand. Then Duke moved first, leaping forward with a growl that shook the stillness. Ezra stumbled, weapon firing wildly. Caleb didn't flinch. His second shot struck true. Ezra collapsed, blood darkening the soil he once used to hide his crimes. Silence settled heavy again. Smoke hung in the evening air. One rider crawled away, wounded but alive. The others lay still. Caleb lowered the rifle, chest heaving. Duke returned to his side, panting hard, a streak of blood on his shoulder, but eyes bright. The grizzly cub whimpered, and Caleb turned toward it. In the end, this fragile life was the only innocent left untouched by greed. He knelt, lifting it gently. It pressed weakly against his chest, a reminder that survival sometimes depends not on strength, but on protection. The small takeaway justice doesn't always wear badges or robes. Sometimes it comes in choices made under fire, in loyalty, proven when it matters most. Caleb hadn't asked for this war, but in surviving it, he found a truth larger than the mine or the locket. Loyalty outlives greed. As night settled, Caleb carried the cub back into the barn, Duke limping beside him. He laid the animal in straw, covering it with an old blanket. His hands brushed the locket in his pocket. Secrets remained, but choices had been made, and soon the final decision would come, not about soil or silver, but about what to do with the cub, the locket, and the truth that refused to stay buried. When the dust of the gunfight settled, Caleb Morgan stood in the yard with a rifle slack in his hands. Duke pressed against his leg, chest heaving, one paw bloodied, but his eyes still fixed on the barn. Inside, the grizzly bear cub whimpered faintly, unaware of the battle fought for the secret it carried. Caleb exhaled slowly, shoulders heavy with exhaustion and relief. Justice had come in the only form the valley knew, swift, messy, final. Ezra Crow would trouble no one again. But the story wasn't over, because justice isn't complete when it ends with death. It becomes whole only when life is given another chance. Caleb walked into the barn, laid his rifle aside, and knelt beside the cub. It blinked up at him, ribs sharp under patchy fur, breath weak but stubborn. He pulled a blanket over it, whispered, "You made it through, a little one. Now it's our turn to help you live." That choice marked the turning. Caleb could have left the cub to fate, said it wasn't his problem. Many might have. But to walk away would have been to let Ezra's legacy win the same legacy of greed that abandoned life for profit. Instead, Caleb chose differently. He chose care over fear, loyalty over gain. Here's the explanation. Wildlife rescue in places like Montana is not a simple sentiment. It's a lifeline. Orphaned grizzly bear cubs rarely survive without intervention. Studies show their mortality rate in the wild skyrockets without a mother's protection. That's why sanctuaries exist from Yellowstone to Alaska, where experts nurse cubs until they're strong enough to return to the mountains, or when that's not possible, to live safely in large, protected enclosures. Caleb knew none of the data, but he knew the truth the same way ranchers always have. Life deserves a chance when it comes knocking at your door. He thought of examples told in town. A hunter once found a black bear cub beside its mother's body near Glacier. Instead of walking on, he carried it for miles to rangers who later reported the cub thrived in a sanctuary. Another story told of a polar bear cub rescued on Alaskan sea ice, raised in Anchorage, then reintroduced when it was strong enough to hunt seals on its own. Those stories carried the same thread. Survival often depends not on strength alone, but on the mercy of others. True justice isn't only about punishing wrong. It's restoring what can be restored. Ezra's greed had buried a life in canvas and soil. Caleb's loyalty uncovered it and refused to turn away. That difference between taking and protecting was what divided men like Ezra from men like Caleb. Days turned into weeks. Caleb fed the cub what little he could, goat's milk warmed on the stove, mixed with scraps softened in water. Duke kept constant watch, no longer growling but circling with cautious curiosity. The cub grew stronger, lifting its head, then its legs stumbling on straw. Caleb smiled for the first time in months when he saw it play pawing at Duke's tail. It was small progress, but it meant survival. Knowledge comes here. Grizzly bear cubs, like all young animals, play as rehearsal for life. Those awkward paw swipes, those tumbles in straw, aren't just endearing. They teach coordination, build strength, and sharpen instincts. Wildlife biologists say play is survival training disguised as joy. Watching the cub reminded Caleb of that. Even the wildest creatures must learn through gentleness before they master power. Fresh perspective followed. Too many wild animals represent danger, claws, teeth, unpredictability. But up close in a barn lit by morning sun, Caleb saw something else. vulnerability. The same kind he felt when Martha died, the same kind Duke felt when he trembled at shadows. In that shared vulnerability lay a connection. Man deer and bear cub, all creatures surviving not by force, but by loyalty to each other. When the sheriff's men finally came drawn by word of gunfire and missing riders, Caleb told his story plainly. They found Ezra's body, Jesse's as well, and took statements with skeptical eyes. But Caleb's reputation, quiet, steady, untainted, spoke louder than his words. The law took the evidence it needed and left him with his land, his dog, and the cub. For once, justice had sided with truth. Soon after, Caleb made the journey to a wildlife sanctuary near Helena. He carried the cub in a crate padded with blankets, Duke trotting close. The men at the sanctuary met him with practiced hands and kind eyes. They explained how the cub would be nourished, how veterinarians would monitor its health, and how one day it might return to the wild, if strong enough. Caleb listened, nodding, but what stayed with him was the simple gratitude in their tone. They thanked him for not turning away. As the cub disappeared into care, Caleb felt both loss and relief. It wasn't his to keep. Wild things never are. But he had given it the chance it deserved. That was enough. The knowledge gained from such moments runs deeper than biology. It teaches that our choices ripple outward. By choosing loyalty over greed, protection over indifference, we align ourselves with what sustains rather than what destroys. Caleb didn't just save a cub. He honored Delilah's bravery, Martha's memory, and Duke's unwavering faith. He proved that some treasures are not in silver or soil, but in the lives we choose to guard. The small takeaway for us is simple. Every day presents us with buried secrets, fragile chances, and silent cries. We can ignore them for comfort, or we can uncover them and take responsibility. The world may never know our choice, but the lives touched by it will. One evening, weeks later, Caleb sat on his porch with Duke beside him. The barn stood quiet, no longer heavy with unease. Duke no longer stared at its walls. Sometimes he padded out to the meadow instead, sitting calmly where Caleb had buried Delilah beside her sister Martha. It was as if he had shifted his vigil from fear to peace, from guarding secrets to guarding rest. Caleb sipped his coffee, looked to the mountains, and thought of the cub growing stronger under watchful hands. Somewhere out there, new life was rising. That was enough to heal a piece of him he hadn't known could heal. And now a question for you. When you face your own buried truths, when life presents you with a fragile chance, will you look away, or will you act? Will you choose the easy silence, or will you step into the hard loyalty that saves lives? If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the loyalty of animals, the cost of greed, or the quiet power of second chances, take a moment to reflect. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, where wilderness and humanity meet, where loyalty triumphs over greed, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it. That way we can keep telling the unpunted stories that remind us of who we are, and of the lives, human or wild, that still depend on our choices.